Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Jean Kozak and I'm your friendly neighborhood epidemiologist biostatistician. And welcome to this module on Introduction to Survey Design. Now, sometime in your career, whether or not it's going to be in research or in your clinical side of the house, you may be, for example, in charge of a clinical service or working within a clinical service. You're going to have to be designing a survey, whether for medical quality management or, as I said, for an actual study. Now, before you begin that step, there's one really important thing you need to consider, and that is the survey approach the correct one? There is nothing worse in my experience than having somebody come to me. They've designed their study, they've collected their data, and now they want some guidance around statistical analysis. And I look at their study and then I realize that it has been designed wrong, that they cannot answer the question or their objectives that they've stated using a survey design. So before you begin, please make certain that the survey approach is the correct approach. Now, let's assume that it is, and you're going to be moving ahead. So there are 5 basic steps you need to keep in mind when looking at designing a survey. The first one has to deal with the overall design. The second one with design of the actual survey instrument, the questionnaire, pre-testing, collecting the data, and then when you're in the home stretch, analyzing and then reporting your findings. So let's look at that very first step. You're designing the overall survey. So of course, the main thing you have to do here, one of the very first steps that is identify the primary and secondary goals and objectives. Sometimes I find people only look at only the primary objective, forgetting the secondary. And that's an important consideration because you may have the correct sample size for your primary objectives, but not for the secondary objectives that you hope to look at. Once you've done that, those objectives, of course, are going to determine the issues and questions you're going to be looking at. It'll determine the population that you're concerned about and also sampling issues from that population. And it will determine the types of analyses you're going to be able to do to answer those questions. Now, your very first step after that is to conduct your literature review. We say this over and over again, but again, it's one of those things that I cannot overstress. It must be done. For a variety of reasons, of course. One has to deal with justifying the relevance for this study. So what has been done before? Are there possible gaps in our current knowledge that you want to explore? Look at studies reported in the literature around unexpected or interesting findings. They may have mentioned something in their analysis that they found quite interesting. So for, let's say, for example, sex differences between older men and women in terms of having access to specialized medical services. And so that may be something that you want to explore. When you're reviewing the literature, look at their sampling strategies. How did they calculate power and the sample size? Look at their measurement instruments that they used. If you're very lucky, they've actually developed a measurement tool or a questionnaire that will satisfy what you want to look at. And they may be reporting some reliability and validity on those tools. Otherwise, you're looking at developing your own, which in many cases is what we're forced to do. Also look at the reported response rates and effect sizes. Those two things are going to help you determine the sampling within your own study. So for example, let's say their response rate was very low. And you want to replicate the study, but you now know that you're going to have to adjust the number of people you're going to be contacting by that low response rate. So you're going to have to contact many more people in order to achieve the correct sample size for your study. And also look at the type of analysis methods that they use. Did they only use cross-tabulations, reporting chi-squares? Did they use t-tests or some other form of analysis? And again, that's going to help guide you when you're thinking of your own survey study. The other thing you have to consider is what sort of the sampling method I'm going to be using. So there are census approaches, and that's where you're doing 100% of the people. You're surveying them. You could have a study where you're looking at using a convenience sample, and in that case, say for example that you're running a clinic for First Nations individuals in the downtown core. So your convenience sample, say, is going to be the first 30 people who walk through your doors of the clinic. Then, of course, there are random samples, different type, from simple to stratified. Stratified is where you take the population of interest and you're dividing them now into groups. Groups could be, you could have it stratified based, for example, on type of practice. Or it could be older men and women between the ages of 70 and 90 or something, however you're stratifying your sample. There's also clustered sampling that you could be doing as well. And this is somewhat similar to stratified. And again, your population, you're creating groups within the population for studying. Then we come into, you have to give some consideration, and again, hopefully the literature is going to guide you on this, on estimating power and sample size. Now, power and sample size are closely entwined. Power is basically whether or not your results from your survey fall within a certain range that's going to be acceptable, and acceptability is defined by the confidence interval. Now, both of these are affected by a number of things, one of which are your goals and objectives. So what are the primary and secondary one? For example, do you have enough power to answer the secondary objectives of that, whether or not there is a sex difference between older men and older women when you've collected data on a wide age range? It's affected by your study design, the size of your target population. Is it a small group or a large population that you're looking at? Say you want to survey the medical residents in your program. Well, you're going to be very limited as to what you can do because the size of that is much smaller than, of course, you doing diabetics out in the community, for example. It's affected by the generalizability that you hope to obtain for your study. So what is the precision and accuracy? And that usually refers to the confidence intervals. Is it at the 0.05 level or the 0.01 level? That relates to proposed analysis methods. Some forms of analysis require larger sample size than others. So, for example, a chi-square tabulation requires fewer people than a logistic model. And then there are other design issues. As I mentioned, the expected response rate. What is the dropout or death rate among the population that you're looking at? The prevalence of the problem. Are you dealing with a rare or a rather frequent disease, for example, and a whole host of others that can be affecting your estimation of power and sample size. Now, let's assume we're doing a simple survey, and we're not going to be doing anything difficult here. So you're just doing a survey that you're going to be handing out, say, for example, to people who are coming to your clinic. And you want to, and you have a prevention clinic, chronic disease prevention clinic, and you want to get their opinion on something around chronic disease management. And so it's a very simple design. So what are the things that you need to know? There are basically 4 things, and these things you need to know regardless, I want to point out, of how simple or complicated your design might be. So one is the margin of error, and again that shows the range your survey results fall in within a specific confidence interval, and all that ever means is it refers to the amount of random sampling error that can occur in your survey that you are going to be comfortable with. The other thing is your desired confidence interval. So these are ones that you probably have heard already, and whether the probability, 95 percentile probability, the 0.05 p, or the 0.01 that your results have achieved. So this has to deal with the certainty level that what you have is actually a true result, that is significant or not significant. The size of the population, the larger the population, the fewer people need to be sampled from it. There's a certain point where beyond that, the people you'll be pulling from them, as long as you have a true random sampling procedure, you're always going to get a nicely distributed group representative of the larger population. The smaller your population to begin with, the rule of thumb is your sample has to be that much larger than you would have had for the larger size population. And the other one is the expected response effect. Now, in clinical studies, this usually refers to what is the meaningful clinical significant difference that you hope to achieve during the study, or what is the size or the magnitude of the effect that you're looking at. In surveys, it refers mostly to the response rate you think you're going to get. If you don't know, then it's a coin toss. That means your expected response rate is 50% because you don't know which way it's going to go. The person may say yes or no. And again, this is where a review of your literature is going to become very important, because it's going to give you some feel as to what that response rate might be. There are a lot of software, if you Google it over the internet, on sample size calculations. And this is just an example of one. And again, this is for a simple survey also. Be very, very careful when you're calling up a web-based sample size calculator that you read exactly for what type of study this sample size calculator is for. So in this RowSoft one that you can see the URL on the bottom there of the slide, asks you the 4 basic questions. So let's just say, in terms of what margin of error you accept, we type in the standard 5%. Confidence level, well, we want to achieve something that is 0.05 or better. So we're setting it at the 0.05 level. Population size, this is a huge thing. The population's very big, so let's put on their ceiling, which is 20,000. What is the response distribution? We really don't know, so 50% or coin toss. And then it calculates for us that the barest minimum we're going to need in our sample size is 377 people. Don't forget that may have to be adjusted depending on what you found from your literature review on things like response rates. Let's look at this again. Let's keep everything constant except the population size. So let's just say that you want to use the residents in your residency program in family medicine. So, and you know there's 100 people, type it in. 80 is going to have to be your barest minimum. So you can see the smaller that population is, the more you're moving towards a census type of sampling model. It also points out a limitation. When you have a very large population, you can afford to deal with low response rates. Here, if only 50% of the residents respond to your survey, you'll see that you will not achieve the sample size that you will need in order to address the questions you're looking at. So be very careful with the size of the population. Now, when you go on the web, there are many different sample size calculators. These are the ones that are specific for surveys, for doing simple like surveys. If you're so minded, go to the CDC website. You can download StatCalc, and it has a nice program in there for calculating power, sample size calculations, for simple as well as more complicated designs. Those of you with a much more statistical leaning, there are stats program like SAS that will do it for you, as well as a piece of freeware that I like using. It's very powerful. It's called G-Power, and it can do very complicated sample size calculations. Now, before I move on, I just want to point out there's a service each and every one of you should be using if you are a UBC graduate student, and medical residents here fall underneath that, and that is the Statistical Consulting and Research Laboratory, SCARL. If you go to their website, you'll see this introductory statement. And what it basically says is that each graduate student at UBC is given 1 hour free consultation time. So when you've pulled your survey together and you have knowledge of your population size, dropout rates, etc., go and contact SCARL and talk to them to see, number one, what should my sample size for my study be, as well as get suggestions from them around analysis of your survey results. They're extremely helpful, and this is an excellent check before you send your survey out the door. And rather than being negatively surprised when it comes back and you find out you can't do your study, you're going to be positive. You'll be a much more positive experience. I'll guarantee you that. Now, there are 4 types of survey methods that you can do. Some studies will employ combinations of these. So let's look at the first one, and that's the face-to-face survey, or the personal interview, or one-on-one interviews. The advantages of doing one-on-one interviews centers around your ability to control the interview, to clarify questions. You can see right away whether the individual understood or did not understood what you're asking them. It gives you the flexibility to probe a little bit more on things that they say that you might be interested in. And you're also able to use complex and long surveys. So clinical studies, for example, will employ face-to-face surveys, usually about an hour in length, where they'll go in great detail on the personal history of their individual, their background issues, and then delve into the topic in hand. The other positive aspect about it is that you're able to check the validity of responses. Excuse me. So you can approach the questions in a different way. You can repeat, getting them to clarify, etc. The negative side has to deal with the time involved in this. It's quite time consuming. If you have multiple interviewers, you're going to have to train them and then test them to see how reliable they are before you go send them out the door. There are travel costs. There are issues that you have to be careful about in terms of bias of the interview. They may be conveying something through social cues, body cues, to the person being interviewed, giving a hint as to which way I should be answering a question. And there's also, of course, concerns by the person taking your survey around anonymity. If you're my family doctor and you're asking me these survey questions, how open or how guarded I'm going to be trying to think of how should I answer these questions. So if you're asking me about my satisfaction of clinical service, how do you think I'm going to be answering you if I want to hopefully continue having you as a family physician? Telephone surveys. The pros, quite obvious, it's cost and time effective. The maximum one usually do for these sort of things is about 15 minutes. Unlike face-to-face interviews, where either you have to go to the person being interviewed or they're coming to you to do it, you're able to recruit from larger geographic regions. If people are hesitating, if you're hearing a hesitation on the phone when they're trying to answer questions, you can clarify it. And also you can do it from the comfort of your home with all your support documents laid out around you to help you if any issue comes up during the interview. The negative side of it is, of course, the questions have to be short and cannot be complex. Your response scales that you are using, so let's say you have a 1 to 5, 1 to 3, whatever, those have to be very concrete because you're trying to convey this over a telephone to someone who doesn't have a piece of paper in front of them seeing these scales. You can't control who might be present at the other end of that phone call, who might be prompting the individual, etc. There's a problem of difficulty contacting individuals. You're going to be spending a lot of time doing repeat calls, trying to find somebody. It's difficult to develop rapport, unlike in the face-to-face interview. You know, you can offer something to drink, sit down, and you talk for a little while before you begin the actual interview. The telephone one, you have to hit that interview running, so you don't develop that rapport with your participant. And also there's issues around directory list access or random dialing. And with the growing use of cell phones and fewer people having landlines, access to those telephone numbers are becoming more and more difficult. And you can see this in the problems that recent surveys have had, for example, or polls have had, polling surveys have had, in terms of trying to determine which direction a voter is moving. They've been wrong a number of times now. There is the third one, which are the mail-out surveys. Again, the advantages, somewhat similar to telephone, they're easy to administer, relatively low cost, able to reach large geographic regions, and usually you can get your hands on the contact list. So the contact list, for example, could be the last year's list of people who came to your clinical service, or people who've been in a diabetic educational workshop for newly diagnosed diabetics. The negative side for that is, again, it's time consuming, mainly because you're waiting and having to remind people to please, please, please send in their completed survey. You need motivated people. All of us in your professional lives get surveys from all over, and you know, time is of an essence. So what do you do to motivate individuals so that they will complete it? There is, just with the telephone one, an issue of up-to-date contact lists. You, of course, are not present either through the phone or physically there, so it's very difficult to clarify questions, or people are making errors when they're responding to your questionnaire. And of course, the people must be able to read or write. That creates certain limitations if you're interested in highly disadvantaged populations, where literacy or knowledge of English, for example, will be an issue, which then means that you're going to be looking at other things. For example, for ethnocultural older adults who are less likely to speak or be fluent in comfortable in English, you're going to have to look at translating your survey into another language, which raises a whole host of other problems in and of itself. Then, of course, within about the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of web-based surveys. The advantages are numerous. Again, you can hit large geographic areas, much larger than even through the telephone one. So for example, I've been involved in one on designing a moral distress scale for family members of people with dementia, and our survey was able to go out North America wide to do that. It's negligible time and costs. The time and costs are really just only in terms of setting up the web-based survey. Some are free, some are going to cost you a little bit to do that. You can of course provide links or pop-ups if somebody wants to look at an explanation of a question. You can control the type of responses. So for example, if you're using a 5-point scale, you'll limit them to those 5 points. They can't type in a 6, for example. It'll say that a little prompt will come up and say something to the effect that that value is out of range. Please pick a number from 1 to 5. And it's easy to control question branching or skipping. We'll go through this very shortly. And one of the other positive things about web-based surveys is data entry is automatic. All the others require you as the researcher, or if you have a research assistant, to sit at a computer and type it in. That input process can create errors that you're going to have to check for, unlike with automatic data entry. There are negatives, however. Your participant must be able to use a computer and a browser. Again, that might limit you as to highly disadvantaged populations. Or, for example, you may be looking at people living in the downtown east side of Hastings there. What's the likelihood that they have access to a computer? Their access is affected by the internet provider. In certain areas of British Columbia, for example, in the northern rural areas, they're still working on modems. So how likely are they going to be able to access and do your survey online? Also, the analysis, and this is an important point I want you to think about when you're selecting the web-based program to do your survey. Your analysis can be limited by the survey provider. And response rate can be difficult to determine. So what do I mean by those 2 points? Some surveys, unless you pay for the full price, will not allow you to download the data. They will have some limited data analysis functionality on their site, so they will give you, say, the frequency that someone said a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 on your survey. If you're analyzing your data and wanting to look at statistical differences between people, you're not going to be able to do it with those summarized results. You need to have the access to the actual raw data themselves. Now, the response rate issue is that unlike the 100 people you sent your survey to, when we flood a survey over the web, unless it's controlled to who it's going to, you really don't know how many people have seen your survey and have rejected doing it. So response rate calculations can be really difficult. So those are the common issues that you have to consider yourself in terms of designing the overall survey. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of designing your actual survey instrument, your questionnaire. 2 things you need to consider: reliability and validity. Now, this is where the importance of your literature review comes back to haunt you. When you're looking at survey tools that have already been designed and reported in the literature, I want you to look at the reported reliability of that instrument. You'll see sometimes it's referred to as scale and item reliability or Cronbach's alpha. And here's an index to guide you. If they report anything below 0.7, don't use it. Anything above, that means it's a reliable instrument and you should consider using it. Now, most of us do not have the luxury of doing a reliability study before we before we send our survey out. So we tend to do something else, and that has to do with the face validity of the instrument. So this is where you've designed your survey, and now you say you want to do a survey of youth using the street clinics. So you turn to the docs who are working in those street clinics, and you ask them, could you look at this survey? Or you ask people who may be in associations, who volunteer, community associations dealing with street youth. You'll ask them to look at your survey and to comment on it. Have I missed something? Should something be added, etc. So when they come back to you and say, nope, this is good, then you can report that there was face validity for the study. There's a stronger form of validity, of course, and again, many people with short period of time do not get into that, and that's the external validity. So, for example, let's say I'm developing that a distress scale for caregivers. Well, how well does my scale correlate with a known caregiver burden scale? If that correlation is high, then I'm able to say that there's external validity for it. Excuse me. You have to identify what it is you're going to be measuring. These are going to determine how you're going to design your response scales and your questions. So, of course, you can do attitudes, beliefs, and opinions. What is your opinion on abortion? Do you believe that everyone should be taking a flu vaccine, etc.? You could be asking questions around behaviors. So you're looking at the frequency, the intensity, or severity of a certain type of behavior. Say if you're looking at spousal abuse, have you ever experienced it? How often? How many times have you required to phone 911, etc.? You could be looking at attributes or traits. You normally see these types of surveys being done in the social sciences when they are looking at things like stereotyping of certain populations. You could be looking at needs, so your evaluation of the needs of clients for, let's say, certain types of educational programs for family physicians dealing with a specific form of chronic disease management within the residential care sector. Or the more difficult one, knowledge. Most of you are going to be familiar with some form of this. Say any of you have taken a workshop and they've done a pre-post survey. So you've experienced that. It's tricky in that you're dealing with the feeling, am I being tested? And that, of course, can reduce the response rate that you might be getting. In those situations, it's going to be very important of how you contextually set up the question in order to make them feel that they're not being specifically evaluated on something. However, it may be actual desire to evaluate somebody. And say, let's for example, you're doing a survey on laboratory ordering of physicians within residential care. What is the frequency upon admission that they should be doing this lab test or that lab test? Now, when you actually sit down and you've considered, okay, I'm going to be doing a survey on needs or whatever, when you sit down, I want you to think of a process when you're starting to develop your questions. And that is, think of it as a funnel. One thing I find, a large mistake I find with people, is they right away start thinking, well, I've got to do a short survey because it's going to be a telephone interview. What questions can I ask? They start limiting themselves that way. I don't want you to start that way. I want you to first start on your computer, whiteboard, piece of paper, write down all the relevant questions you can think of for your survey. Don't hinder yourself in terms of it's too long, there's too many of them. Just write it out. Then I want you to separate them into 3 piles. Those questions I must ask in order to be answering my stated objectives. Those questions that would be nice to ask, and those questions I don't need to ask. Look at those questions that I must ask. If you feel that you can ask a few more, go to your nice to ask pile and take some of those and move it into your actual survey, draft survey that you want to do. Then also identify the demographic questions. There's the standard ones in terms of you male, female, what age category do you fall into, but there may be other important questions that you want to ask them about in terms of their occupation, in terms of income levels, etc. for you should be considered. Once you've done that, look at that pile of must-ask questions and look at the number of them and start moving them around in terms of the flow of the questions you should be asking. Now, when you're writing the questions, I'm going to get back to the flows very soon, but when you're writing the questions, there are certain criteria I want you to think about. One of which is the degree of relevancy. So in that pile of must-ask questions, they must be highly relevant. Make certain that your question is accurate. If you have a survey that all you're asking is, oh, well, overall, how is your general health? And you want to be looking at, say, chronic disease management among your diabetic patients, asking overall question is fine as a single question unto itself, but it's not going to be giving you specific information that you're going to need to know. So, for example, whether or not they're suffering from neuropathic pain, do they inspect their feet every day, etc. The other thing to consider when you're writing those questions, what is the required level of knowledge that person needs to answer that question? The more your survey participant falls into a professional category, the higher level of knowledge you expect that person to have. And so you can ask questions at that level versus somebody from the general population. Make certain that your questions are clear. And we're going to be going through something about this very shortly. Look at the likelihood that they're going to answer your question. Is your question something that is very sensitive? And the sensitivity issue is going to determine where your question falls within your survey and actually how are you answering it. Look at your response category. So for those questions that are in my must-have ask pile, what's the best response category? Is it a yes, no? Is it a 3-point scale, a 5-point scale? Or is it an open-ended? Do I want them to write their own comments in there? Also, look at the context and the time frame. The time frame is a major one. It imposes severe restrictions on how long you have to do the survey and also the length of the number of questions you're going to be asking. The context is an important one because it's going to be a motivating issue for that person to actually do your survey. Now let's get into these issues of clarity, etc., around how to write your survey questions. Some of them are very straightforward, so in other words, only ask one question at a time. Do not ask multiple questions within a single question. Keep your questions clear, short. Define terms before asking the question. If it's not intuitive, to the general person from the population you're taking your sample from. Make certain that you explain what it is that you're asking them either to do or to concentrate on. Provide a realistic or specific time period for your survey and questions. If you leave this to the last month of having to have your report in, I guarantee you you're not going to be able to finish it. So there's one aspect of time, but the other time aspect is for the respondent. So you have to be able to tell them that it's only going to take you anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, or is it going to take me an hour to do this survey? If you're doing an internet-based survey and the person isn't motivated, which one do you think they're more likely to do? The 15-minute one, the 5-minute one, or the 1-hour one? Here's an example of what I mean by a specific time frame for the individual built within a question itself. So here's a typical survey question. Have you recently been feeling depressed? Recently is the problem. One person may be thinking, well, in the past year, no, I've been fine. Another person may be limited to the past month. Another person to the past week. So the better question to ask, if it's depending on what your time frame of interest is over the past year, have you ever felt depressed? Use terms and concepts that have the same meaning across all possible participants. So not only do you have to worry about the literacy level, the knowledge level of your sample, you also have to make certain that the terms that you are using, the wording, that their understanding is going to be same from one individual in that sample to another individual within that sample. Do not use jargon or slang unless it's dictated for you to do so by your sample. So if you want to look at drug use among young street kids, you could possibly use common slang for certain types of drugs. You would not do that, of course, if you're looking at drug use in the general population. Not only they may not be aware of that slang term, we know that such terms vary from one geographic region to another. So if you're doing a national-based survey, what they're calling that drug here in Vancouver may be quite different than what they're calling it in Halifax. Avoid questions that use a negative or a double negative, because then you really don't know what the response means when somebody does something like that. So let's look at this one, common one. Do you disagree that your family doctor should not provide counseling on whatever the topic is? And so you get yes, no, or an uncertain for that. The problem is not only do you have a double negative sitting in that, basically within that question of a disagree and a not, if someone answers no, what does that actually mean when you have a double negative? So avoid that. The other thing to avoid are double-barreled questions, because again, it's unclear what a person is actually responding to. So let's look at this one. You're doing an evaluation of a clinical service and you're asking people to rate the service that we received on a variety of dimensions. And one of your questions is, I felt understood and respected by the clinic, physicians, and staff. So you get someone responding. Is it they're responding on the dimension of understood only? Are they responding on the respect dimension only? Are they thinking of physicians in the clinic? Are they thinking of the nurse that they met within the clinic? Or all above? As I mentioned earlier before, be very careful on overusing technical or so-called educated wording. So look at that first one. In the last 12 months, have you received the pneumococcal vaccine? If you're asking physicians about whether or not what percentage of their patient population received the pneumococcal vaccine, it's fine to say that. In the general public, you're going to come across people who do not know what pneumococcal vaccine means. So it's better to have said, in the last 12 months, have you received the flu vaccine or, say, a flu shot? Avoid abbreviations, contracts, or symbols. And again, this is going to depend on the population you're dealing with. Let's say you wanted to look at preventative behaviors in the general population around diabetes. So if your question said HbA1c, how many people are going to understand that? Or understand the term glycated hemoglobin? Or how many would better understand it if you just asked the general question whether or not they've had their blood sugars tested in the lab, say in the last year or something along those lines. Do not use loaded or biased words or phrases. Avoid creating expectations of what the response should be, and don't use leading questions. All three of these are entwined. You commonly see this problem in political parties when they are doing their survey, because they want to lead you to respond in a certain way. So look at that very first one. Physicians have a difficult time in managing frail older adults. And then you're going to ask something around that. Well, right away you've set up an expectation that, yeah, physicians have a difficult time. Frail older adults are difficult to manage. And so you may be leading the person to answer in a certain way by how you phrase that, versus saying, physician experiences in managing frail older adults can vary. So you recognize that there's a wide range of things, but you're not saying that it's a negative one to begin with. Let's look at another one. Let's say you're doing a survey of your fellow medical residents, and you want to look at their preparedness of, when you're doing your rotations. So you ask this question: medical residents can feel ill-prepared when doing a rural practice rotation. How prepared did you feel? Not prepared at all the way to completely prepared. What's wrong with this question? Of course, you've led them in that first sentence in saying that, well, the expectation is that you're going to probably feel ill-prepared. And now you're asking them to rate their preparation. The better question should have been something along the lines of, overall, the residency prepared me for my rural practice rotation. And then you ask them, the degree to which you either disagree or agree with that statement. Or you can use an open-ended, you can use a different approach. You can actually list the specific type of procedures that that people can have difficulty with when they're all by themselves out in a rural setting. And you can list that and then ask your strongly disagree or to strongly agree ratings for those specific procedures if that's what you're interested in. Branching and skipping. This deals with you being able to move a survey participant to the relevant questions based on their previous answer. So let's say you're doing a survey on in the general population of the prevalence of migraine headache and what do people do about it. So your first question up front, you can have in the past month, have you had a migraine headache? They say yes. They're directed then to questions having to deal with severity, duration, medication, etc. If they say no, you may want to ask them the question, have you ever experienced one in the past year? Rather than have to, it should be have you, I should point out. and then ask them a series of questions, or they get directed straight to the end of the surveys and thank you because that group is not of interest for your study. Now, earlier I mentioned the issue around question sensitivity and also sequence. The rule of thumb is overall you should be thinking that your survey should march from the general questions to the specific. I like using this approach because the general sort of basically invites an individual in with non-threatening questions, and then you move them to your specific ones that you wanted to ask about the study, as well as more sensitive ones. So look at these two questions. How many sexual partners did you have in the past 3 months? And how many times did you fall in the past year? Would you have this as your very first question in your survey? The first one I think is pretty obvious. The second one is less so. If you were doing a survey on falls in frail, older individuals, research has shown this type of question to actually be rather threatening. Threatening because it's embarrassing for me to report I'm falling a lot, or I'm afraid that if I admit to that, I may be identified and therefore I may be removed from my home. I know that sounds extreme, but those are actually comments from people who have taken, seniors who have taken surveys around falls and their fears around them. Now, what you actually do with questions like that is the opinion will vary from one expert to another expert. It has to deal with how they were taught to do surveys and their experiences with surveys. But all of them are going to be agreeing on several things. First of all, it's important to set the context, the wording, confidentiality, and anonymity to this individual. So let's look at our senior, our frail senior. It's better to start your survey with a little introduction, saying something to the effect that everyone has fallen one time or another, and then ask the question of, in the past year, have you experienced a fall? So right away you set the context that I'm not an abnormal person if I respond yes to this. Don't start your survey with these questions. Instead, move them towards the middle or near the end of the survey. If your survey is going to be on falls, then I would make it like my second or third one, this general one, after setting the context, and then get into gradually more specific information around the falls that the older person has experienced. And again, as I said before, typically move from general question to the specific questions of interest. Now, we're coming to this other issue that you're going to have to juggle with, and I hope I'm not losing you because there are a number of things that you need to keep in mind. And this is, of course, an equally important one, and that is how do you motivate the participant to ensure you're going to get the response rate that you need to complete your study. There are a number of issues that are going to motivate me to do your study, one of which is the relevance and significance of the issue to me. So let's say I'm a diabetic and you give me a survey on diabetes and management of it. Well, I'm probably going to be more interested in that, doing that survey, than a younger age individual who's highly into sports and fitness. You know, it doesn't affect me, so I'm going to disregard your survey. Who is sending the survey? Let's say I want to do an evaluation of the medical residency program within the department. And over the web, you get an email from me saying there's this Dr. Kozak who wants to do this. Well, who is Dr. Kozak? Versus the head of the department sending you a little announcement about the survey. Which of the two are you more likely to look at and respond to? The initial contact explaining the survey. Again, this is setting up the context of the survey that you're doing. Sometimes it's better not to do a cold survey, so just sending out the questionnaire. Rather, if you have a limited population, send them a notice that, say, the department is undertaking an evaluation, or the medical residents are taking an evaluation of this, and within the next week you'll be receiving a survey. We appreciate you doing this. It's totally anonymous, etc., etc. Let them know the expected length of time to complete the survey. When that's missing, I'll quickly usually go and look at the survey, and if it's something that is really long looking, complicated, etc., I'm less likely to do that survey, as compared to, say, you telling me it's only going to take me 3 to 5 minutes to do this survey. Make certain that it looks simple and easy to do. So if you have multiple questions, online surveys are great for that, because then you're just showing, let's say, 2-3 questions. But one thing I like to do is on the top right hand side, I'll say that this is page 2 of 5 or something like that. So as the respondent, I'm gauging how much longer this is going to take me to do. Then there's what's called the Dillman method, and that's the use of reminders. Dillman was in marketing, and he came up with this way of increasing response rate in surveys, and that's where you send out your initial survey. 2 weeks later or so, you send out a little reminder notice saying, this is just a reminder that last time sent you the survey. If you completed it, great, thank you so much. If not, would you please do so? If you do not have a copy of this survey, please either go to this website or contact me through whatever to do that. And the Dillman method has been shown to increase rather dramatically survey response. You have to balance that with how many reminders are you sending out. Usually you only see like 2 sets of reminders going out, because otherwise you're crossing into that realm of somebody pestering me to do this thing. Now, the other consideration that you have, okay, you've done your wording, you've checked to make certain that you don't have your double negatives, they're not leading, etc. What are the response categories? So what's the best way that I want people to respond to each of those questions? And there's a variety of ways, of course, of designing these. One of which is the open-ended. That's, for example, in your own words, please describe your experience visiting our clinic. And so you have some lines there that people will type out, or you're online, you're going to have a box that they can type in. This is a really rich way to go. It allows for the uniqueness of a response in the person's own words. The downside is it's extremely time consuming to deal with this if you have a lot of them, and it can be difficult to analyze. You have to figure out, are you going to be coding these? Are you just typing text directly in? And then how are you going to actually analyze those texts? In my own experience, I do use open-ended, but I limit how many there are. And I'll select it for certain questions where, if a person answered in a negative direction, I really want to know why they felt that way. So let's say they circled a 3 on my 2 on my 5-point scale. And then I would have, if it's an internet-based survey, a little pop-up saying, could you please explain why you feel that way? And then they can type something in there. Your response categories can also, in contrast to the open-ended, is closed-ended. And this is where you have, I apologize for the offset there. You are limiting the type of answer a person can give you. So here you can either do a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 and not invent a 4.5, which you then are faced looking at trying to struggle to know how am I going to analyze that. And that's a problem that you have in paper-based mail-out interviews. You'll typically see something like that happen, or a person will draw a line between the 4 and a 5. What do you do with that sort of thing? So the closed-end response provides commonality of response, so it's limited to only to those 5 of your scale, and it focuses the persons to the categories of interest. So in this case, a 1 is a disagree, a somewhat disagree, a 2 is a disagree, 3 neutral, 4 agree, and 4 is a somewhat agree, and the 5 is the agree. And it's easy to analyze. These are the kind of data you want if you're going to be doing tests of significance, for example. Now, your response scales can be binary in nature. So, that's the yes, no, or are you a male, female, etc. Your response scales can be forced choice scales. So the first one there, going 1 to 5, you're forcing them for a single type of answer that they can give. Other questions can have multiple forced choice. So, for example, how would you describe your responsibilities at the clinic? Select all that reply. So someone working there, it could be a clinician, could be doing administrator, could be doing research, or they could be doing other things as well. And other is typically where you would see a pop-up window come up and you say, please explain. Another type of scale are the visual analog scales. And you can usually see this in pain research. And what you have is sort of a ruler type in front of the individual, in same a scale that's marked off in millimeters. And you ask the person, please indicate on this scale, how would you best describe your pain today? So they draw a line. These scales are easy to use. It's easy to use, especially when you're dealing with populations like young children, where communication might be an issue, or people from different ethnocultural backgrounds who do not have English as a main language. From a research standpoint, the reason why you use these things is it optimizes the amount of variance accounted for by the scale dimension. So it's likely that you're going to be able to capture how a person feels on this scale of 0 to 100. And you'll also be able to capture any changes in that feel set in that perception of pain after, say, 1 hour when you gave them an analgesic, or you may have done some sort of comfort-related therapy. The problem is it's difficult to know what it means. What is the difference in someone who does that first one or someone who does the second one? Setting aside the subjectivity around pain itself that's difficult to deal with, I would not know what is the magnitude difference between those, actual magnitude difference between those two individuals. To get around that, people have been using what are called face scale. So like this is the faces pain scale. That again is great, for example, with young children. WHO uses variations of this when it's doing its cross-country type of studies, where there tends to be a consistency in a facial expression and a feeling that you're trying to get them to rate it on. Another type of response scale, and it's probably the one that you most commonly have heard about, is one developed by Rensis Likert. Some people say the name Likert. Either way is fine. He was an American psychologist who, when he was a graduate student in 1932 working on his dissertation, he came up against this problem. He wanted to measure people's attitudes around international issues, but he didn't know how was he going to analyze that other than sitting down, breaking sentence by sentence and figuring what to do with it. So instead he came up with something ingenious. He decided, well, why don't I take the domain of interest and put a scale to it? Say a 1 to 5 scale or 1 to 7 scale. And so those scales, ever since 1932, have been called the Likert scale. It's the most commonly used scale, as I had mentioned. It's an ordinal scale, and what that means is say you have a scale of 1 to 5. Well, you assume that 1 is less than 2, which is less than 3, which is less than 4. And it also has known interval, equal intervals. So the difference between 2 and 1 should be the same as the difference between 5 and 4 on your scale. These scales typically vary in length and dimensionality that you're rating. Research has shown that for most type of studies, the best length of scale to use is a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. But be very careful, it depends on the question you're asking. Some may be best with a 3-point scale or a binary scale. It's also the positive side around, or the strengths around the Likert scale is that it's robust for use with significant testing. So if you're doing univariate, say you want to calculate means and standard deviations, you can do that with a Likert scale. Whereas if you do it with an open-ended scale, you can't do that. Same with multivariate, so if you wanted to do a t-test, for example, or logistic modeling, trying to predict, say, death in a certain, based on certain survey questions. You can do that with a Likert, you can't do it with others. So again, be very careful of your scale you're selecting. Now, Likert scales can either be balanced or unbalanced. All that means is that the balanced scale assumes that there's a neutral point, and around with you have the same number of scale points. So let's say if you have a 5-point scale, 3 is your middle, and 1 and 2, 4 and 5 are going to be your negative end and your positive end. The unbalanced assumes there's no neutral point, and a positive around that is that it avoids misinterpreting what does the neutral point actually mean, or its overuse. I've been involved in studies where you get people that say you have a 7-point scale, and what they've done is, or let's say in this case a 6-point scale that you can see there, all they've done is run down the neutral side, or the undecided side, sometimes that's referred to. Well, that's not telling you much information. So that first one there, how satisfy you with the information provided in this lesson, you can see that that's an example of a balanced scale. You got 2 negatives, 2 positives surrounding that neutral or undecided. The other one, how did you find the amount of information provided in this lesson? Too much, about right, too little. That's an unbalanced scale, because about right is not a neutral point or an undecided point. When doing your scales, make certain you use labels and anchors. They provide meaning to the scale value. Remember that ruler scale, the visual analog scale going from 0 to 100. Well, if someone marks the middle, what does that actually mean? So what researchers who are heavily involved in survey designs like to put labels to each of the values. So for example, you can use strongly agree to strongly disagree, but my 4 may mean something different from your 4. You may not see that as a neutral point. Versus the bottom example there, where everything is clearly labeled and I understand what a 4 means, what a 3 means, what a 5 means. You still run into a problem that each and every one of us face when we're doing these scales is, are the intervals actually equal? Unless you get into heavy psychometric testing, we really don't know, other than looking at it and saying, well, it looks equal. I've got strongly agree somewhat, and I have that at the other end, and I have my neutral point. There are many different types of response categories you can use. You can have one on frequency, quantity, intensity, the likelihood of something. You can have satisfaction, etc. When you're struggling with your scale and what it should actually look like, Google it on the internet. There are plenty of examples out there put out by different universities, etc., around good response scales. Look at that. Look at them, see whether or not they fit what you want to do, and borrow. Then think of your overall survey structure. I've decided everything, my sampling, the method I'm going to be using. I've designed my questionnaire. That's all done. And that, now I want to design the actual survey. So very first thing you're going to need is that cover letter or web page that specify who's doing the study and why, what I'm being asked to do, how long is it going to take, confidentiality and anonymity issues, who will have access to the actual data, and ethics approval. You won't be doing ethics approval if this is a medical quality management study, but for everything else will require ethics approval. Then you're going to have an introduction and some instructions. I know it's buried in that letter, but people skim letters very quickly. So when you start your actual survey, when they move to it, have up front a paragraph, again explaining what this is and what you're going to be doing. You know, please rate yourself on the following, that sort of thing. One thing I tend to do in my surveys, if it fits, let's say I'm getting their opinions about something, whatnot, I like to put in a sentence saying that as this survey, in this survey, I'm interested in knowing your opinions. There is no right or wrong way to answer this survey. So I'm setting it up that I'm interested in what they think, but don't worry that there's a right or wrong way to answer this one way or the other. Again, your flow going from the general questions leading to the more sensitive ones. Your demographic and identification questions, are you male, female, your age, etc. Some people say put that up front. I belong to the group of people put that at the back. The reason is I feel I want to get them into the survey, introduce them into it, answer the questions, and then I'll say something to the effect of, to help us better understand the results, could you please answer the following general questions about yourself? And then at the very end, don't forget to thank the participant for their time. So now we've designed the overall study, the survey, and now we're going into a really important other phase, and that's pre-testing the survey. Now, pre-testing sometimes refers to as pilot testing. It's going to help you determine what questions work or will not work. It'll help determine how well your instructions and questions are understood, whether or not your questions are appropriate. It helps determine the ease of use and appropriateness of your response categories. It helps determine the flow of questions. You may find in the pilot test that certain questions are awkward where they are, and so that you need to move them. You'll get people to time it. So what's the length of time to do this survey? You'll find out, are people motivated to complete my study? And also, for much larger studies, you do pilot tests to look at methodological issues. So you may want to do a pilot, say you want to do a large study looking at the clinical effectiveness of some treatment intervention, but there's some issues you need to iron out, like recruitment and response rates, etc. And so you'll do a pilot study before you walk out and actually do the big study on that. So who do you pilot it on? Who do you ask questions about? You do it with colleagues, people you can tap on the shoulder, You do it with experts in the field, and this is where that face validity comes in. So let's say I'm doing something on abuse and neglect. Well, I want to get in touch with people who, say, are with advocacy associations or have done research in the area to look at my survey and tell me whether or not they think this survey is appropriate, have I missed something, etc. You can do it with the population of interest. So let's say that you want to do something with Muslim seniors in the Lower Mainland. You can get a group of them to look at your survey and try to fill it out, and then you'll ask a series of questions about their experience in that. Do it with a small group, 10 or so people, unless you're doing that larger pilot study to look at methodological issues. That's a different thing altogether. But don't forget, you cannot use this group. So if you got, say, 10 of your colleagues to fill this thing out, and you're going to be asking them questions around timing, etc., you cannot use them in your part of your main study. You're going to report the findings, but they can't become part of the analysis of the main study. So you've got your 10 people. What are you going to ask them? You can ask them these specific questions. Did you find the questions to be clear and easy to be easily understood? One nice thing about pilot studies being done over the internet, you could ask this question of every survey question. So let's say they filled out a survey question having to deal with the management of type 2 diabetes, and then right away after they gave their response on a 5-point scale, a little pop-up comes up. Was this question clear? Able to understand this question? However you want to phrase it, yes, no, that type of thing. How difficult were the questions to answer? The response categories that you're using, that 1 to 5 scale, was it appropriate, and did it capture how they felt about that issue? So you may have a 1 to 5 scale, but they're saying, geez, I don't think about this issue along the degrees of satisfaction. I think of it along this other way altogether. Were the directions clear and easy to understand? Should some questions be removed? Should some questions be added? And get them to time the survey. For those of you who are a little bit statistically inclined, there are actual quantitative measures that have been developed. So, for example, one is the Content Validity Index, that people do a rating of each question on, and you can use that, the analysis of the CVA, to determine which questions to throw out, modify, etc. So now you've done your pre-testing, it's finished, and now you're into that collecting the data phase. So you lean back and relax, and that's the last thing you should be doing. This is where you start running into problems if you're not careful. Instead, what you should be doing are 3 things. Monitor the collected data as it's coming in. Am I getting, it's now been 4 weeks since I've had the survey out and only 10 people have responded. What am I doing wrong? So it's something you're going to have to look into. Prepare your databases for analysis. So if you're using a paper-based survey or a telephone-based survey, you're going to have to design a database where you're coding data into say, Microsoft Excel or Open Office's version of Excel. If you're using a web-based one, that's being done for you, but be very careful that you're using numeric codes rather than text codes, and I'll get into this right away. The third thing you should be doing is cleaning data errors. So let's just say I already have collected about 40. I'll do a frequency analysis on that 40. I know I have a scale that goes from 1 to 5, so I should be seeing frequencies for how many people selected a 1, a 2, a 5. Oh, wait. The analysis shows that somebody had put in a 6. So that could have been me doing or my assistant doing a data coding error when I'm keying it into an Excel file, or something really strange has happened. So you now have the time to go back and look at that and fix it before you actually start analyzing the data or having someone to analyze it for you, and then you waste a lot of time going back and forth cleaning your data file, which is going to be costly. So when you're preparing your actual data file, so here's the way to think of it. Every row is going to be a participant, and every column is going to be a variable based in a numeric code. So look over there and you'll see sex. So sex, you see a 1 or a 2. People will put an M for male, F for female. That's fine except for some statistical packages where you have to group individuals based, say, on sex, and the packages do not allow you to use a letter code. They require you to use a numeric code. So if you use the letter code, you're going to get that sent back to you by the statistician saying, fix this up, please. Same with age. Your age, for example, there can be the actual age in years of the person, or if I was using age category, say from 20 to 29, 30 to 39, etc., I will code that as a 1, 2, etc. And don't forget to hand that code dictionary to the statistician looking at your data. So now all that's done, now you're into that final stretch which has to deal with analyzing and reporting the data. So in the analysis, and what you're going to be reporting in the analysis section, you'll calculate your response rate. You may have to recalculate the power if your sample size you were unable to obtain what was needed. You may have to calculate to see whether or not you had the sample size in your survey to do the analysis that you want to do. If you have categorical variables, so the male, female, people between the ages of 30 and 39, you're going to calculate the frequencies and percentages for each of those categories and report that. If you have a scale, so like a Likert scale, or a continuous variable, so for example the actual age in years, or it could be a laboratory result, say the A1C levels or lipid levels, then you can report also the frequencies and percentages, but you're also going to be reporting means and standard deviations and number of missing cases. If you have categorical variables, sometimes I've had requests from people for calculating means. You cannot calculate a mean on a categorical variable. And then you're going to be doing your tests of significance. And you know, these can be simple ones or multivariate analysis ones, such as the logistic regressions, or you could be doing things like, for example, analysis of covariance, as well as post hoc tests of significance. Now, in a purist world, we don't like that, because you should have stated what your hypotheses were before you do this study. And certainly you're going to be doing that for your main and secondary objectives. But we all do post hocs because when you're analyzing the data, something pops up that you didn't expect. And if you calculate that you have enough power, you can do this post hoc test. So for example, let's say that you were never thinking of doing a gender analysis of your data, but all of a sudden you saw that, oh, it looks like there might be a sex difference. So you ask yourself, do I have enough people who are male and female who've answered those questions to do that analysis? And if you do, then you can do a post hoc on that and then report it. The next is, of course, the final one, and that's the actual writing of the report. And this is just a standard layout in terms of a short abstract, a few hundred words, the introduction where you talk about your literature review, and which leads into why I'm doing this study or did this, study. Then you're going to have your methods section where you're going to talk about your survey design, whether or not you did if you did a pre-test, then you're going to talk about that. You may be talking about power calculations in there, or you're going to mention your sample size that'll be necessary to be recruited, and then you describe how I actually did the study. Then you're going to have your analyses where you're going to report what you did on the previous slide. And then you have your discussion. And so you're going to be starting with the interpretation and meaning of your findings. So you're going to be making reference back to your results section, talking about what those things actually meant, or what you think they mean. You're then going to relate your findings to relevance with your literature review. So is it supporting studies? Is it adding new light? Or did you find something that is absolutely contrary to what everybody else was reporting? Then you're going to be talking about your strengths and limitations of your study, as well as ending up on some statement around the possible future work or directions. So, for example, in your analysis, you may have found something you didn't expect in one of them. Then you're going to say some of that future research is needed on this to pursue what may be causing this difference. Then you're going to have your conclusion, your nice wrap-up, and then you're going to have your reference section. Overall, then, and just in ending, these are some of the key steps to remember in terms of having defined goals and objectives, planned analyses, how you determine your sample size, what it is, making certain that all your questions and response scales are clear, meaningful, simple, etc. That your survey should be of reasonable length and time. The more committed and captured your sample group is, then you have that greater luxury of doing a longer survey versus cold surveys where it better not be long, otherwise your response rate is going to be very low. Of course, avoid jargon, abbreviations, etc. Unless those specific terms are being used by the population that you're interested in. Avoid leading the person or misunderstanding questions because of double negatives. Watch your flow, prepare your coding, and don't forget to thank that participant at the end of this survey. And to end, pilot test, pilot test, pilot test. It doesn't matter how short your survey is, how long it is, whether you think it's very simple or not. Have a few people look at it. It's always best to have a few eyes catch something right in the beginning before that survey goes out and you find out that you really can't use that result that you base this on. Well, that's it. Apologize for the whirlwind tour through there. If you keep these points in mind, you're going to do well on your surveys and construction of them. So all the best, and take care.